Hello and welcome to the final lecture on the course of the Civil War. It's the last year of the war, and we're here in spring of 1864. And looking ahead, it's not guaranteed that the Union will prevail in their goal of eradicating Southern society and ridding the country of slaves. There still is the possibility of a negotiated peace, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, what we see here in this painting is Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman meeting during the off period during the winter, and to discuss the strategy for the next year. And it's decided that Grant will take charge of the Army of the Potomac in the east, and that he will engage Lee and continue that goal of capturing Richmond, the capital of the South, which in every year before, at this time in the spring, they'd put as an objective and had failed utterly in them, as Lee had not only defended but actually counterattacked, first at the Battle of Antietam and then at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so they're going to try it again. And meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman, will do a thrust in from the west, come in from Mississippi into sort of the deep south. Now, time is crucial. This has to be the last campaign. A failure to succeed will most likely result in a loss for Lincoln in the November election. And so they understand it's now or never. If Lincoln is to lose the election to the Democrats were campaigning on the promise of a negotiated peace, which would most likely mean the slavery would continue where it exists, and then the future will be what it'll be. So the campaign is going to get underway, and we've got this map. I've blown it up. This is sort of the smaller map, and we're going to get our first engagement between Grant and Lee at the Battle of the Wilderness. And this was brutal fighting, head-to-head fighting within a thick forest. Well, they say the wilderness, and the forest ends up catching on fire in some places, and many of the soldiers just burned to death. And the losses were considerable for the Union. For Grant, 18,000 casualties. No casualties meaning dead, wounded, and missing or captured. And Lee suffered 11,000. So the Union suffering more, but this is, keep in mind, the Union can replace their soldiers. Lee cannot. He's at the point where he has no more replacements. There's nobody he can call up to replace his losses, whereas the Union can. And so this is going to be the beginning of a war of attrition, which is continuous fighting until one side simply runs out and is no longer able to fight. Now, at Wilderness, Grant disengages the fight. And in the past, the Army of the Potomac, after, a battle and an unsuccessful one, had always returned back, back to Washington, back to the north. This time it's not. Grant's going to be different. He's going to make his objective not Richmond, which is down here. He's going to make his objective and change it to Lee. Wherever Lee goes, he goes. And he's going to engage him again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Again, Grant loses 18,000 casualties. Lee, 12,000 casualties. Again, at North Anna, a smaller battle. Lee's at the point where he realizes he needs to dig in deep fortifications, and he's going to build trenches. And this is the first time we see trench warfare. Famous in World War I, is a very strong defensive measure. Lee's going to undertake this. And so the casualties at North Anna are not as considerable because Grant does not engage these strong fortifications. But at Cold Harbor, he does. And it's the one regret he had from the entire war, where he lost 13,000 men to Lee only 2,500. And Grant gained nothing. And Grant's getting this reputation as the butcher. And whether or not that's fair, maybe that's up to you to decide. But Lee's, in a position where he knows he cannot win militarily, but refuses to surrender. And Lee's strategy, of course, is to bide for time, which gets to our final one at Petersburg. Lee makes camp in this town of Petersburg and builds up very formidable defenses. And Grant, refusing to attack those defenses on good grounds, he would suffer very heavy losses. He instead undergoes a siege, a long, drawn-out, starve the enemy into submission. And very important, if you see the date, this begins in June of 15, and it will not break before the election. And Lincoln at this point is despondent and in despair that Grant was unable to defeat Lee's army before the election in November. And in a sense, he almost gives up. But we get the breakthrough, and it's not here against Lee. It's down south with William Tecumseh Sherman. And Atlanta, September 1864, a key victory for Sherman of a very important industrial hub for the South. You know, they'd started the war not very industrious, but they'd had to adapt, and Atlanta is a key transportation hub and industrial hub. And he captures this, and morale boost in the North, and Lincoln does win the election and wins it quite handily, 55% to 45% in the popular vote, but in the electoral vote, a bit of a landslide that in this election. And it was an election not just of the Republicans. They joined up with pro-war Democrats into a new political party, a one-time only special sort of election, the Union Party, as they called themselves, and defeats McClellan, his old commander of the Potomac. And after the election, we're going to see one of the most controversial and audacious military tactics ever deployed by William Tecumseh Sherman. He burns Atlanta to the ground, and he's going to begin his march, and his march, as he says, to make Georgia howl. And this is a psychological inducing of fear and humiliation into the South as he moves from Atlanta, and he's going to march deep through Georgia, cut off from his supply lines, and what his objective ultimately is Savannah, but that's sort of unknown of where he's going to go. Now, this is a little deceiving of showing where he's marching this nice straight line. In fact, he broke the army into a number of different columns, and as they marched, they burned, they destroyed the rail lines, Sherman's neckties as there's known, destroyed the infrastructure, burned the cotton gins, confiscated food. They didn't starve the people, but they took what food they needed as they went, and took thousands and thousands of pounds of corn and chicken and cows and wheat and others. And made Georgia howl. And as he said, we are not only fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies. I know that this recent movement of mine through Georgia has had a wonderful effect in this respect. Thousands who had been deceived by their lying papers into the belief that we, the North, were being whipped all the time, realize the truth and have no appetite for a repetition of the same experience. And the devastation was quite thorough. And as one historian wrote, Sherman had accomplished an amazing task. He defied military principles by operating deep within enemy territory and without lines of supply or communication. He destroyed much of the South's potential and psychology to wage war. And as he marched, he had tens of thousands of freed slaves following his army. And it created a bit of a problem of what to do with them. And so he ordered Special Field Order number 15, as it's called, in January of 1865 to deal with the immediate problem of this refugees, where he provided 40 acres and a mule, 40 acres of land and a mule, as it sort of be called. He had lots of extra sort of animals with him as well, and said, yeah, if you want one, take one. Need some tools, take one, for these freed slaves. And the land that he was given was abandoned land along the coastline. And as he saw it, this was a temporary measure to the immediate problem of the refugees, not a permanent solution of what to do with the freed slaves. But it did provide a precedent. President Johnson would later repeal this order, Johnson replacing Abraham Lincoln, but it is sort of establishing the goal of freed slaves of what they would like most at the end of the war is to be provided with land that they could labor on their own for themselves, and they could have economic independence. And so we'll get to this in due time of reconstructing the South, and this being one group's main goal. At the same time, shortly after this, the 13th Amendment is passed through Congress, and it, as it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as the punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. No more slaves. It's in the Constitution. This is the first of 3 Civil War or Reconstruction amendments, with the 14th defining citizenship and defining that freed slaves are citizens, and the 15th, the vote cannot be denied to them because of their race or that they were slaves before, but not gender. And that really disappointed a lot of the female abolitionists and divided them of whether or not to support the 15th Amendment or not, because it did not grant them the right to vote. Now, this was the siege of Petersburg. We come back to this beginning in June of 15 and not ending until the next year. So now we're into another year. It's another spring of 1865, but this one's not going to last. The South is a beaten people. Lee's army is a defeated army. The people of the South are morally dejected, in large part from Sherman's march. And they leave Richmond right there. Richmond will be abandoned. Petersburg will be abandoned. And there'll be the final sort of surrender at Appomattox in April 9th, 1865. As the Southern Army left Richmond, they burned it. And there's Lee surrendering at the Appomattox courthouse with Ulysses S. Grant there watching on. And they're very lenient to those remaining soldiers who were allowed to simply go home. And we'll see what is the aftermath from all of this. And the last to die is Abraham Lincoln, shortly after the surrender of the South. All right, we'll stop it there. Thank you very much for listening.